Welcome, everyone, to the onpoli podcast. I'm Michael McGrath.
I'm Sabrina Nanji.
And I'm Émilie Gougeon-Pelletier.
We're a provincial politics podcast, but today we're talking about a federal MP resigning his seat and how that has dominoes falling all the way to the opposition benches at Queen's Park.
And after nearly 15 years of construction, the Eglinton Crosstown finally has an opening date. Will the opening go smoothly or go off the rails?
Unlike the Eglinton Crosstown, the Darlington Refurbishment Project was delivered ahead of time and under budget. How does the plan fit into Ontario's energy strategy, and why did the province scrap its climate goals?
It's February 6th, 2026, so let's get to it. Our audience might note that Steve is not here this week. Instead, I am joined by Sabrina Nanji, who writes the Queen's Park Observer, a newsletter covering all things Queen's Park, and Émilie Gougeon-Pelletier, who covers provincial affairs for Le Droit. Thank you both for being return visitors to the podcast.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you.
The last weekend, the Progressive Conservative Party had their big convention. Doug Ford had the main headline speech. Sabrina, what did you think?
Yeah, I actually was there. The PCs decided to do a 180 and actually allow media into the room for Ford's speech.
Yeah. Sorry, a bit of context there was we were told initially that media would not be allowed,
Right.
Which was a huge departure from past practice. And the Queen's Park Press Gallery rightfully made a bit of a stink about it, and they eventually, the PC party retreated and eventually did allow reporters in.
Yeah, it's a bit bizarre not to have us in there, especially for the speech of the night. Like a political convention is when you want to, pump up your party, kind of send the message out that everything's going well. Obviously, Doug Ford had a lot to celebrate. This is basically 1 year after his third majority mandate win.
Yeah.
And the speech is usually pretty talking points heavy. So I don't think anything majorly controversial would be happening, but they did let us into the room for the dinner. And I have to say, it was well attended for maybe the fact that it was in the middle of winter and not anything, major happening like we saw in Calgary with Pierre Poilievre and the federal Conservatives, a big high stakes leadership review there. There were about 1,000 people in the room. Folks I talked to seemed happy to be there. One fellow told me that while some parts of the convention were boring, he was happy to support Doug Ford. He's really happy about his business policies and that sort of thing. One, I guess maybe unplanned part of the speech, and it was actually not really very, very noticeable, but there were actually a couple of protesters that stood up and started shouting about Grassy Narrows and the mercury contamination there, and whether there would be compensation for that. Doug Ford did not skip a beat and just kept on going. His OPP detail got them right out very quickly. But I think the biggest applause that Ford got, he got a standing ovation, is when he said he was going to run again for a fourth term.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of us are really thinking about an election yet, but hopefully not one anytime soon, even though we've gotten rid of fixed election dates.
Yeah.
But Ford said he's going to be the guy who will lead the PC party. Whether or not he'll be successful, I guess, is the big question.
You mentioned the optics, and there was some allusions to the concern that there would be a lot of empty seats in the room because of the federal Conservative Party's convention in Alberta. There was this, a thought that maybe all of the Ontario-based activists would be in another province. They wouldn't have enough people to fill the room. There was some hints that was what they were really worried about. That they didn't like the idea of the Premier speaking to a half-empty room. Seems like that wasn't the actual problem.
Yeah, I mean, it looked, busy enough. Like I said, 1,000 people, the tables were full. But, as in terms of what party insiders tell me is they don't think 1,000 is maybe the strongest number. And there were, it was a battle of delegates, dueling delegates here. Pierre Poilievre had more than double that at his convention. But again, I think a lot of people went because they wanted to have a say on his leadership. What was interesting is that I think the PCs, if I'm speculating here, might have expected more to attend because they actually kept their early bird pricing at like $299 per delegate, and usually it's a little more than that. It's obviously a fundraising move too for the party, and so I think that they kept it at a lower rate just to get more people to come. As a non-member observer, you got to pay a little bit more, $1,000. And I did see Liberal MPP Adil Shamji there, very closely tailed by PC staff. He had to do his scrum outside in the cold. But again, I heard it was actually 8 degrees in Calgary. So I think for some PCs, they might have had the better weather over the weekend.
Émilie, your thoughts?
Well, I didn't get to attend, but watching the speech from afar, all I could think about was, what's the next slogan going to be? Because, it's kind of becoming a bit of a running joke at Queen's Park, the Protect Ontario ad nauseum.
Yes.
So I was thinking about that a lot, and who knows, by the next provincial election, Donald Trump may or may not still be in power. The need to protect Ontario, where is it going to be by then? Is the premier going to be still just as popular as he is now? Looking forward to that new slogan for sure.
Yes. Yeah, no, and we're not going to do a your column, my column segment this week, but I did have thoughts about Ford's comments, and people can read them at tvo.org. But, one short version, exactly what you were saying, Émilie, that Ford can say, well, I'm excited to lead our party for a 4th time, but events between now and then are going to be what decide this, right? And, just think of how different things are going to be if, for example, the Democratic Party does very well in this year's midterm elections and President Trump looks weaker in a year's time, right? How much sense is Protect Ontario going to make as a slogan? Just, any number of things can happen between now and then. Sabrina, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to add a little bit of gossip because there's these rumors that there have been some cabinet ministers who were actually in the room on Saturday when Ford made his speech that might be, mulling over a leadership bid themselves. Maybe, the next PC captain, if Doug Ford wasn't going to do it, he obviously said he's not going anywhere. And so I think that was kind of pointed maybe a little bit towards them. Yes. But you're right. I don't think that it will be a slam dunk. He's riding high in the polls right now, but who knows what the political landscape is going to be. And I don't think Ford's popularity is necessarily because people really love him and what he's doing. It's because of a lack of good opposition alternatives right now. And so I think the NDP has a lot of work to do. I know we're going to talk about them a little bit later, but also the Liberals are in another leadership vacuum. And so a lot could change. It will be a decade by the time, or maybe more by the time the next election comes around, and every government has a shelf life. It could be, time for a change just in general for Ontarians.
Yeah, and just to sort of draw that out a little bit more, what you were saying, that if he had said anything other than, I intend to run again to lead our party into the next election, it would have just been the, firing the starter's pistol for the next leadership race, whether it was announced or not, right? And all of those people, those cabinet ministers who, wake up in the morning and they see a future premier in the mirror, they would start organizing. Of course they would. And we've seen this happen to other political parties where a leadership challenge can derail a government, even if the premier doesn't necessarily have any intention of stepping aside.
Right.
And so with that, we are going to go to issue 1. Bill Blair was, until this week, the federal MP for the riding of Scarborough Southwest. So why are we talking about him? Because the federal Liberals have already found their candidate to replace him, and she's the provincial MPP for the same riding. The catch? She's Doly Begum, the new Democrat and deputy leader who was, until Tuesday, second only to Marit Stiles in the official opposition. There's more to discuss here, but we're going to start with that. Sabrina, not a great day for Stiles, was it?
No, this was a huge blow. And, NDP leader Marit Stiles said herself that she was completely blindsided by this. She was not expecting her deputy leader to defect to another party in a whole other jurisdiction. This I think this really caught her off guard. It's a riding they've held for the last 3 election cycles. And so I think it'll be difficult for them to keep the seat, only because by-elections are a bit of a wild card, right? Turnout tends to be lower. Doug Ford has to call the by-election by the beginning of August, essentially. And so this could be a summer thing, could mean turnout is even lower. And we do know that all parties are going to be pushing very hard for this. In terms of Marit, I think it's interesting because they're having a caucus retreat at Queen's Park this week. And I think she'll really put on a big show about all her MPPs are aligned behind her. We're all on one side, on one team. But Marit Stiles has really had some obstacles since the last election. I mean, they lost seats, they lost the share of the popular vote. The Liberals did better on that front with them. She got a really bruising 68% in her leadership review, and she, head started to roll. She's shaken up a lot of her inner circle, her top staffers. She just brought in Caitlin Pettifor, who had worked for Wab Canoe and Manitoba, successful NDP leaders like Rachel Notley out west. And so I think that while she has been making these changes, and maybe that's appeased a lot of the party membership, losing an MPP like this is just a huge blow for her. And I know we're going to talk about it more, but like this has really just set off like a wave of political reactions across Queen's Park and even federally.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen former MPPs come out of the woodwork to criticize the direction of the party, something that started before Stiles was leader and has continued under her. You mentioned her 68% support in the last leadership vote. That was obviously enough to spare her the fate of Bonnie Crombie, who was turfed, but given Begum's departure, Émilie, I mean, do you think that we are going to see questions about Stiles' future reopened?
Well, that 68%, is a little bit more than the 57% that Bonnie Crombie had received in her last leadership vote. But to your point, there certainly will be discussions around this in the coming weeks, especially if you consider the fact that the Ontario Liberal Party, despite Crombie's loss in her own riding and her resignation, did increase their numbers of seats at Queen's Park, and might eventually get some momentum if they elect, if the members decide to choose a stronger leader.
Right. And so speaking of the contest to be the next Ontario Liberal leader, Begum's resignation, this is like how the dominoes have fallen in the last few days. It's been fun to watch. Yes.
I call it.
Begum's resignation now means there has to be a by-election in Scarborough Southwest provincially. And now we get to our second piece of news, which is that the Liberal MP for Beaches East York, riding I live in, Nate Erskine Smith, has quickly announced that he will be running to be the Liberal candidate in Scarborough Southwest. Don't believe the party's made a decision yet whether he will just be named the candidate or whether it will be a contested nomination. We'll see how that goes, but he will potentially be up against the most recent candidate in that riding, who was Liberal Kadira Jackson. She said in a statement, the Ontario Liberal Party needs a candidate who will be a full-time candidate. This is one of the criticisms that Erskine Smith has faced consistently over the last year, that he's treating provincial politics kind of like a consolation prize, a fallback plan, given that his federal ambitions have not materialized the way he might have wanted. Just geographically, I'll say, Beaches East York and Scarborough Southwest, they are adjacent ridings. A lot of the community events that happen in Beaches East York will tend to bleed over into Scarborough Southwest. I have to believe that voters in Scarborough Southwest, they know Erskine Smith's face, they know his name, he's very familiar. So even in the chance that this is a contested nomination, I have to imagine he's got a pretty solid chance of both winning the Liberal nomination and potentially winning the race itself. But as you said earlier, Sabrina, I mean, I suspect this is going to be a very competitive race, not least because the PC party and the government, the premier, gets to choose the timing of the by-election. Sticking with Erskine Smith and his moves here, what do you think the significance are?
Yeah, I mean, this has essentially become like a proxy war for the Liberal leadership contest, right? I've already heard from Liberals publicly and privately that they would be really upset if the party decided to make this an acclamation and not run a contested nomination. I mean, like you said, Kadira Jackson, the former candidate, just started ripping into Nate Erskine Smith. The race isn't officially on yet, but a lot of potential leadership candidates, especially those who don't have a seat, might be unhappy if this was going to be an acclaimed nomination contest. But like you said, I think Nate would certainly be a front runner. I think he could pull it off. And if you want to be leader of a party and do things right, then why not show everyone that you can win a nomination and then go on to potentially win the riding? But it was interesting to hear Doug Ford say he wants to turn that seat blue. The Liberals have placed third in the last 3 elections, so it would be a bit of an uphill battle for them in Scarborough Southwest. But one interesting thing is I think if Nate were to be the candidate from the PCs, who actually could get someone very high profile, they had run on Gary Crawford, former budget chair, Toronto councillor in Scarborough Guildwood. So I do think that they could put up a good fight and potentially take this seat from the NDP. But one interesting thing this is going to serve as like a preview if Nate is the candidate for the attack line that the PCs would have. Because remember when Bonnie Crombie became leader, they were like so quick out of the gate with attack ads against her. And that rule in politics is, define yourself before your opponents can do it. I don't think Bonnie Crombie was very effective at that. And so I think we will see a bit of a sneak preview of, what could happen down the line, even if Nate Erskine Smith becomes the leader. And certainly he'd be a front runner in that race too, but even more so if he is able to win this seat and then have a seat in the House and go face to face with Doug Ford, who has not faced a Liberal leader in the legislature in quite some time.
I mean, he's never faced a permanent leader,
right?
Across across the House from him. Like he's only ever faced interim leaders,
right?
In the legislature. One guy,
yeah.
John Fraser. John Fraser about to start his third time as interim leader. Émilie, your thoughts?
Well, I think it would be interesting to see if Nate Erskine Smith can secure, the ability to run in the riding, to actually win the seat, and then to also become leader, because as you said, this would be the first time since Kathleen Wynne that we see a Liberal leader actually have a seat in the House. But we also know that on the political spectrum, Nate Erskine Smith is probably the most progressive that we have seen in a long time. Bonnie Crombie and Stephen Del Duca being coined as red Tories. And again,
advertise themselves as a break with Kathleen Wynne's progressive side of the party.
That's
bringing
right.
the party to the center, that kind of thing.
And that's what's been said, that's what the Liberal Party of Ontario needed to contrast with Kathleen Wynne, but it clearly seems to not be working. But also going back to the NDP of Ontario, I'd be curious to see what kind of impact a Nate Erskine Smith leadership for the Liberal Party would have on the New Democrats, because they're known as the more progressive party at Queen's Park. So another hit it might be for the Ontario NDP and Marit Stiles leadership.
Right, and we've already seen this to a certain extent federally, where Carney's success was as much just wooing NDP voters to his side as anything else, right?
And especially now with Doly there, who I think he's kind of securing his left flank. I mean, Mark Carney has been talked about as being, maybe a small C conservative, and that's why it's a struggle for Pierre Poilievre. Even some delegates at the PC convention were telling me that they voted for Mark Carney and they support him too, and they support Doug, and it's because of, these kind of business-minded policies that they're putting forward. So I do think it was even more interesting for the federal Liberals to pick up Doly Begum for them and maybe kind of appease some of their more progressive voters. But for Nate to be leader, like you said, I don't know who's going to try to out-left each other, the Liberals or the NDP. That might be
the Greens.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can't forget about them. Yeah.
I guess my one last thought I will add here is just the language that Erskine Smith has been using in his announcements this week, saying that he's all in on provincial politics. I think is very interesting. As I mentioned, he's faced some criticism in the last year as treating provincial politics as a bit of a fallback plan, and he seems to be trying to address that directly, saying that there is no plan B for him. He has said that he will resign his federal seat if and when the provincial by-election is called. But until then, I'll just remind people, it is still a minority parliament federally. And so his commitment at the moment is basically to the Prime Minister, like, I'm here to be a warm body in the Liberal benches so that, you don't lose a seat when I resign. But when the province calls that by-election, he will be heading to provincial politics. Just one last note on the Liberal leadership for our audience. We do expect to learn what the rules for the Liberal leadership contest are going to be on Monday, I believe, on February 9th. One potential candidate we had been keeping an eye on, we've mentioned her a few times in the podcast, was Dr. Danielle Martin. She is now also running federally for the Liberals. She will be their candidate in University Rosedale to succeed Chrystia Freeland. when Erskine Smith does resign his seat, there will be another federal by-election in Beaches East York. There are at least one or two more other MPs who are being speculated as potentially resigning. So it's going to be a very busy spring for federal by-elections, I suspect. And the situation here is still very fluid. But all that said, Sabrina, do you have any inklings about what we might expect in terms of the rules, or are you hearing anything about the Liberal leadership?
Yeah. So I think the timeline is the thing that everyone is going to be looking for. I know you guys in your column have kind of made the argument that sooner is better than later.
Yes.
And that makes sense, right? Because you have more time for Ontarians to get to know you. You have more times to combat whatever the attack line is going to be from the PCs and even the NDP. But some Liberals I've actually talked to have been pushing for a 2027 race, which surprised me. And one insider told me that, well, if there's a big scandal with the RCMP investigation on the Greenbelt or Skills Development Fund, then it might start looking like Doug Ford and the PCs would not win the next election, and it might attract more high-profile candidates to the Liberal leadership race. And it was like, well, what if pigs start to fly?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a big, what if, especially if you're talking about, pushing the race down the line. So the last I heard was potentially September, but obviously we'll see, the actual, what they actually decide next week. And I also heard that they're going to be introducing online voting, which would be a new thing for the party, but I think would also, increase participation and get more people to actually have a say in this.
Yeah. I won't relitigate my entire sort of argument for a faster leadership process, but I will just say, in the time since Bonnie Crombie's unsuccessful leadership vote, or however you want to put that, she didn't quite resign immediately, but in that time, they could have already had a leadership process. They could have a new leader in place, and that leader would be in a position, for example, to run in the Scarborough Southwest by-election, right? They would be in a position to capitalize on these events, and I really think that the party is getting too cute about trying to figure out the perfect process that they'll control every variable, and you just can't, right? The point is to roll with the punches, so to speak, and actually capitalize on events as they happen. And that I'll get off of my soapbox.
Well, it might have been, Bonnie Crombie's doing too, because remember in September, there were questions about whether she was going to stay on as leader, and then she said she's not, but she's going to stay on until we find somebody new. And now she's saying, never mind, I'm resigning.
Yes.
So it's possible that all that wasted time could have been filled with, other avenues and opportunities for the party. But, Bonnie Crombie.
They did not seem to be in a terrible hurry. So, of course, with the discussion of leadership conventions, I just have to acknowledge the absent co-host here. Steve, of course, is going to be yelling at his screen, watching this, saying, "Say something about a delegated convention." No prospect of this. I believe the Liberal Constitution still requires that it's a ranked ballot. So they will, whether they do in-person or online voting, it will still be some form of ranked balloting. The Liberals, of course, held the last substantial delegated convention I think we're ever going to see in Canadian politics back in it was right before COVID, right? It was the Del Duca convention. Right. So it would have been the January or February of 2020. Mm-hmm. It deeply upsets Steve that we've moved away from delegated conventions. Nevertheless, we have moved on, and we are going to move on to issue 2. Mark your calendars. The Eglinton Crosstown LRT has an opening date, February 8th, 2026. This comes after nearly 15 years of construction, delays, and cost overruns. It's a huge milestone for the line and perhaps the end of a major headache for the province, or maybe the start of a new one. What else should we know here, Sabrina?
So the TTC, which is operating the line, is going to be doing a phased start on Sunday. Trains are running from 5:30 in the morning till around 11 at night. That'll be free on the first day. Buses will be running after that. It's, I guess, a cautious approach. And the same we saw with the Finch West LRT, which has been a bit of a disaster, not off to the greatest start there. And the TTC says that the phased start was a recommendation from the inquiry into the Ottawa LRT LRT. So potentially lessons learned. But I think when this thing is unveiled, it shouldn't exactly be a ribbon cutting with a ton of fanfare. I think there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered about, what took so long and cost so much. This thing has been, 15 years now and over budget. Doug Ford called it a nightmare the other day. And so I think that it'll be a lot more questions than anything.
Yeah. Émilie.
Well, you know what? I think it's good to know that the TTC is interested in following through with the recommendations from the public inquiry into the Ottawa LRT launch. But I'll say what people in Ottawa said for a long time and what people have been saying here about the opening date for the Eglinton Crosstown. I'll believe it when I see it, because just recently Global News reported that the Finch West LRT was using a switch technology that was similar to the one that crippled the Ottawa LRT system, and that the public inquiry had warned other transit systems not to use it. So you'll have to excuse the O train trauma on this one.
So 2 questions for both of you. Do you intend to ride it on day one?
Nope.
Nope.
No, I will not be riding it, but I know a lot of reporters will be, and so I'm curious to see how that goes. I think I'm a little traumatized just from transit in general, but I don't have high hopes that this one will be running as smoothly as we've seen, just from past LRTs. But I'm like waiting to see, the big photo ops and what comes out of it.
They say you have to be patient about launches. They tell the public, there's going to be some obstacles along the way. That's, I'm going to wait for the obstacles to be done with, and then maybe I'll experience the joys of the
There was some discussion
LRT.
in my household this morning about would we bundle up the kid and it's supposed to be really cold on Sunday, and would we go and ride the crosstown? I still haven't gotten on the Finch LRT yet, so we have yet to make that decision. We'll see. It just, I don't know. We've talked about this LRT so much on this podcast, and it is wild that we're I think finally reaching the end of the story. But one of my colleagues who works here, when it is up and running, he is going to be able to rely on it. At least he will be able to use it. And his answer when I asked basically the same question was I'm not going to believe it until I have ridden it 3 times in a row. So we will see how it goes. We will be back next week to talk about the early reviews, I'm sure. But for now, let's move on to issue 3. Unlike the Eglinton Crosstown, here's something that was delivered ahead of time and under budget: the Darlington Refurbishment Project. The project was completed 4 months ahead of time and $150 million under budget, and the reactor will be delivering power to the provincial electricity grid on February 12th. The refurbishment will also keep the reactors going until at least 2055. Émilie, thoughts?
Hey, on time, under budget. Keep it up. More of that, please.
What a time to be alive.
Yeah.
You don't hear that often about government projects.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that the Darlington Refurbishment and the Eglinton LRT had the same budget of about $13 billion each. And even though the nuclear refurbishment came in under budget, it was, when you look at almost $13 billion, 1.5 or 150 million, it's about 1.2%.
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem like a drop in the bucket, but still, something that the government was obviously pumping up, and this was a good news story for them.
Yeah, I will say, not to, rain on anybody's parade, but this was not a decision that was made by the Ford government. The Darlington and Bruce refurb contracts were both signed by a Liberal government. One of the things that Kathleen Wynne did back before the energy file became entirely toxic for the Liberals, they had set out the direction of refurbishing the nuclear fleet and reaffirming the centrality of nuclear power in the province. People will argue, of course, about how clean nuclear power really is. It doesn't directly generate greenhouse gas emissions, but there is, of course, nuclear waste. Nevertheless, this is 50%-ish of the province's electricity mix. So, you would think that this would be something that the province would love to talk about in terms of its ambitious climate policy, except I can barely even say that without laughing. Émilie, you had some reporting about the ambitions of the provincial climate policies, or perhaps the lack of ambition.
Yeah, well, you're right. The cleanliness of nuclear power is something that's often used as an argument by the provincial government every time it receives criticism or pushback on its climate policies. And it is an argument that they used just recently to justify the decision to get rid of the legislative rules that forced them to establish climate targets and publish progress reports. I'm sure you remember JMM. The Minister of Environment, Todd McCarthy, has said multiple times that what matters isn't targets, it's results. But we did find out through a Freedom of Information request that the ministry experts had actually looked into the possibility of establishing new targets and had shared those options with the minister, along with some science-based facts, before he decided to just get rid of them altogether. And what was interesting too is in the ministry's response to our findings is that they blamed President Trump and his attacks on our economy, Protect Ontario, and the government is taking a hard look at unnecessary processes and unnecessary processes that are holding us back. That was the response.
And in this case, they're saying that the climate targets were one of those unnecessary processes.
Exactly.
So I think we've talked about this on the podcast before, but just some of the legal context was that people will remember that Ontario was being sued by minors, young people, about whether their charter rights to personal security were violated by the province's less ambitious climate targets than the ones that they inherited from the Liberal government. The Court of Appeal had said, yes, if the government is going to have climate targets, then those climate targets have to comply with the charter. And the government seems to have taken that court decision and in essence said, well, in that case, we're not going to have climate targets at all. And based on your reporting, there was at least some debate within the public service about potentially taking a different course.
Yeah, and when you talk to the opposition parties, the NDP, the Greens, obviously, and environmental experts, they say that this is just another instance where the government has ignored its own experts, and as well as the science, but that at least now they're being honest about it.
And with that, we're going to go to the mailbag. If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, send it along to onpolitics@tvo.org. And I'm going to give one of our hosts a chance to reach into the ceremonial mailbag here. What do we have today, Sabrina?
Okay, so here's a question from Malcolm Campbell in Windsor, who writes, excellent presentation with Liam Casey. Bring him back. More stories on the Ring of Fire. Also, how about election stories of places not in the center of Ontario's universe? Yes. Southern Ontario, Windsor, Chatham, Essex, LaSalle, Amherstburg. We too hold elections. Yes. My best. Windsorite, Malcolm Campbell. Spicy.
So Malcolm's letter is, of course, in reference to our episode last week. We had Liam Casey from the Canadian Press on to talk about, he did an excellent feature article about the Ring of Fire and the politics within the Indigenous communities there. We also mentioned a few municipal races, but perhaps we did not get far enough from Toronto, maybe far enough from this office for Malcolm's tastes. So let's talk about other municipalities. What are we keeping an eye on, Émilie?
First of all, I want to say that I agree fully with everything that this Windsorite writer has said. But for my part, I'll be definitely looking at Ottawa. Mayor Mark Sutcliffe had received a promise from the PCs and Doug Ford that the O train would be updated to Metrolinx, and so far we haven't seen any action on that. So it'll be interesting to see if the voters feel like Mayor Sutcliffe has been doing enough lobbying on behalf of his city to the province on that file. And because Le Droit has a focus on Ottawa and Eastern Ontario issues, we'll be covering the municipal elections for the region of Prescott-Russell and all the Eastern Ontario regions that have a strong Franco-Ontarian presence, such as Cornwall as well.
Okay. Sabrina.
So I won't say Toronto.
Okay.
even though I might want to, but I won't.
Stipulate that we're all going to be watching Toronto.
Yeah. But one other race I'll be looking at is Mississauga. I hope that's far enough for Malcolm, but I think this race is going to be interesting. We just heard Doug Ford this week giving a glowing endorsement of Carolyn Parrish, the current mayor, who succeeded Bonnie Crombie. Ford said it was refreshing to work with her, a not so thinly veiled shot at Crombie. And there has been rumors that Crombie might be looking to run for mayor again, which would be very interesting. She obviously wasn't able to win her seat there provincially, but maybe she thinks she's got a better shot at City Hall. And Carolyn Parrish was also a former councillor when Crombie was mayor, and there was really no love lost between those two. No. I think it's no secret who Doug Ford and the PCs would be supporting and maybe send some volunteers down to support during the race. But I actually think that would be a really interesting matchup to watch.
Worth saying that an endorsement from Doug Ford does not always guarantee success. Of course, in the mayoral by-election here in Toronto, he endorsed Mark Saunders, the former police chief,
Kiss of death.
Came in third, I think. So, was not a great performance in terms of the Premier's coattails, let me put it that way. So I'm going to be looking a little bit further afield to Sudbury, where there has been, for like 10 years now, I last wrote about this nearly a decade ago, an argument in the city about where to build a new event center. Last time I wrote about it, there was the fight was over building it out in the periphery of the city, and the belief was that this sort of greenfield site was going to be the best way to generate lots of new jobs for the city. That plan fell out of favor, and they decided to build an event center more sort of centrally in the city's downtown. And so, the construction is, I think, underway. Certainly, it is expected to be underway this summer. The municipal elections are in October. And yet, this week, there is a declared candidate, a city councillor who says he's now going to run for mayor, saying he wants to stop the construction and go back to the old plan. And so, no debate ever happens just once in municipal politics, right? We could talk about Toronto's history of transit votes, but I will be watching that election in Sudbury to see if this particular issue gets reversed once again. I will also add, and we spoke a bit about this last week, that one of the details in this Sudbury case is that the announced candidate, the city councillor, says that specifically he will use strong mayor powers to stop this arena, even if it is already under construction. He will just zero out its budget. And of course, mayors have strong discretionary powers over their budgets thanks to changes made by the Ford government. And this is just one example of something I think we're going to see a lot of in this election season all over the provinces, various mayoral candidates promising to do major, perhaps even extraordinary things with strong mayor powers.
It's interesting because I can remember very clearly that at the last municipal elections, we were making the rounds through the municipalities and candidates for city council, asking them, will you be using the strong mayor powers? And it was a selling point for them to say that we are not. So it's going to be interesting to see what the voters of Sudbury feel about that promise.
Yeah, no, and I think we might be seeing the politics of that change slightly, where when it was still kind of new and perhaps scary to some people, a lot of candidates thought it was safest to say, I'll have nothing to do with these strong mayor powers. And as voters sort of get used to the idea a bit more, perhaps, I think, we'll see, but perhaps at least some candidates are willing to be a bit more forward about using them. All right. Again, if you'd like to ask about any content on the show, please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org. And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, February 6th, 2026. You can follow the show wherever you get your podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel. Any feedback you have, we are always happy to hear it. Once again, write an email to onpolitics@tvo.org. Be sure to include your first name, last name, and where you're located. This week's episode was produced by Matthew O'Mara, editing by Colin Kish, production support by Jonathan Hollowell and TVO's digital media services team. Laura Few is the executive producer of digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content. Special thanks, of course, to our crew for making the video podcast happen. And thanks, of course, to my guests today for everything you contribute to the show. Thank you so much. Until next Friday, bye-bye, everyone.